Hello everybody, I hope everybody's doing well. Got everything all organized to make a video, so I wanted to make a test video testing out this format. I have a place here for clips and art, and a place over here for some background music and visuals and things. Just wanted to make sure that this was a good central position from which to speak to the camera. I have a good mic. My camera's not the best, but I could upgrade at some point. At some point, I want to begin talking about the topics of some of these clips down here. One of my favorite topics of study is Sumerian mythology. As I was studying things, occult magical philosophies and theosophies and mystery schools and various occult practices, at some point I traced mythologies back to Sumerian, and the Sumerian tablets themselves grabbed me. Initially, the first I had heard of the Sumerians was from Zechariah Sitchin, and that by itself is an interesting story. I think that he didn't have it exactly right, but he introduced people to the idea and the concept, and I began asking questions in my own mind, like, what do the tablets say themselves? Where do they come from? What is the history, the secular history of that civilization, and how did it begin? I remember in high school and world history, they kind of glossed over that whole era. They just said, as far as we know, civilization began in the city of Ur. And they gave a really quick, brief rundown of priests starting the city of Ur. And I never really thought about it much for many years after that. Eventually, I started questioning things, questioning religion, which seems to be the source of so much strife. And I began researching religion in order to answer my questions about it, understand it better, and why it leads to so much trouble. Myself, I was kind of raised outside of the churches and things like that. My mom read the Bible, but that's about it. I was raised in the Bible Belt, though. But I also remember rebelling against the Bible Belt, listening to a lot of alternative music, which prominently figures the goat all the time, right? Lucifer, Satan, the goat. This, rebellious attitude, this juxtaposition to the idea of God. So, whenever I eventually got to Sumerian research and got far enough back, I saw this goat figure. I was like, what? There's a goat in Sumeria. A goat from the underworld. A goat from the Abzu. The horns. The horned god. I was like, what is this? There's no way. And I began to read the mythology of Sumeria. I got to this particular myth called the myth of Adapa the Sage. And it was one of the earlier myths that I read of Sumerian mythology, but as I was reading it, I was like, what the F, right? This is supposed to be one of the oldest stories known to humanity, from the first civilization that had written records, with one of the first myths that they wrote. And it had a story of a guy who's just a fisherman and a cook. He tends the temple. He cooks with clean hands. I was a cook for many years. So whenever I read that, I was like, this guy knew what he was doing. He was a cook, and he made sure his hands were very clean. That's a simple thing. It's such a simple thing, but to be in such an ancient civilization, to have the presence of mind to keep a clean area that's well stocked with food. One day, while Adapa is just doing his daily duties of supplying fish for the temple, he's out on the sea, which in theory would be the Persian Gulf, which is the sea situated next to Eridu, with Eridu being the city that was founded by the figure, the god Ea Enki, in honor of the goddess Ninhursag. Adapa was a priest of Ea Enki, supplying Ea Enki's temple in Eridu with fish. He's fishing out on the ocean, and a strong wind from the south capsizes his boat. He falls into the home of his lord, which is the sea. He falls into the sea. Ea Enki is the god of the sea, the Abzu, the underworld. So in their state of mind, passing beneath the surface is going into the underworld. It could be the subterranean ziggurat temple in Eridu, which is built beneath the surface in the underworld. It could be falling beneath the surface of the sea into the chaos of the abyss. Adapa falls into the chaos of the abyss. He falls from his boat into the sea. He comes out of the sea. He raises his fist at the sky and curses the south wind. That was another thing that caught my attention, because how many times in our lives today do we go through difficult times and shake our fist at the sky, saying, why? Well, whenever Adapa did this, the wind quit blowing for 7 days, which makes it one of the first known recorded events of magic being performed by someone other than the Anunnaki themselves. Due to the fact that Adapa breaks the south wind, it catches the attention of everybody around. It catches the attention of Anu and Enlil, the lords of the land, and Adapa is called up to Nibiru, the temple of Nibiru, where Anu and Enlil hold court. Before going to the temple of Anu and Enlil, to the gates of heaven in their terms of thinking, to the seat of royalty, Ea Enki goes to Adapa, and Adapa asks Ea Enki for advice. Ea Enki is Adapa's god, above all other gods, and Ea Enki is the god of Eridu. So Ea Enki gives the advice to Adapa that whenever he gets to the gates of Nibiru, there will be two prominent figures standing, two guardians at the gates of Nibiru. One of them is Tammuz, and one of them is Gishida, also known as Ningishida, which is later found to be a name for Thoth, the Atlantean. Ningishida, in the hierarchy of the pantheon of Sumerian gods and goddesses, is one of Enki's children, and Tammuz is a god who's symbolized by a kind of a Cupid-looking figure. It's like a child with flies, but it's a symbolic thing of his presence, being a Cupid-like cherub presence. Anu is seated at a throne, presumably in heaven, and Enki tells Adapa that whenever he approaches the gates, to address the two gods guarding the gates and say how they and remark on how they are missed in the land below, in order to gain their sympathy and favor, and for them to introduce Adapa to Anu in a favorable way. Ea Enki tells Adapa that they'll be offering him the bread and water of life, and garments, royal holy garments, and anointing oil. He tells Adapa to refuse the bread and water of life, and that they are actually the bread and water of death, and that it's a trick. This part of the myth is open to some speculation. Some say in the articles and academic analyses of this that it's symbolic of Enki being a trickster god, tricking Adapa into giving up immortality. And in some points of view, it's for a lesson for Adapa to learn. Perhaps the bread and water of life are bad, or perhaps they will trap him there in heaven and he'll be made a god and he won't be sent back below. Perhaps Enki has further future plans for Adapa. Perhaps Enki, as a god of the underworld, doesn't want Adapa in the Nibiru heaven above, but wants Adapa as a steward of the underworld. There's a lot of ways that could be construed. But in any case, Enki tells Adapa to refuse the bread and water that's offered to him in Nibiru. Enki tells Adapa to wear mourning clothes, which is like sad mourning garments, humble garments, like rags, so that he's humble in his appearance whenever he approaches the gates and Anu in the temple. After all of this prayer and meditation that Adapa does to his god, Enki, and the advice that's given to him by Enki, Adapa ascends to the gates of Nibiru and does exactly as Enki says. The goat, the ibex of the sea, the great stag of the Abzu, the lord of the underworld. Adapa does exactly as he says. He approaches Tammuz and Gishra. He remarks how they're missed in the land, and people miss their presence and how they are favored gods in the land below. This strikes Tammuz and Gishra, and they shine favor upon Adapa and greet him with favor. They offer him a royal garment, an anointing oil, and Adapa accepts the royal garment and the anointing oil. They offer Adapa the bread and water of life, and Adapa refuses the bread and water of life. Anu questions Adapa for refusing the bread and water of life in his court, and Adapa humbly says that this is simply the humble advice of his god, and as a humble servant of his god, he is going to follow his god's advice, and he respectfully declines. This upsets Anu in the myth, and Anu mockingly disregards Adapa. He says, fine, then if it's your world below, your Eridu below that you want so bad, go back down there. But from now on, curses will be upon the humans below, and they will have sicknesses. Adapa accepts his fate and returns to the world below. This part of the story indicates that this is a point at which humanity loses its immortality and longevity. That before this point, humans were living to be much older, perhaps. Maybe they were giants. They were naturally living to be much older. Or maybe they were living in some kind of harmonious balance with nature that allowed them to live very long. Perhaps the bread and water of life were something strange. Maybe they were blood and flesh. People were somehow living longer through the consumption of blood, because there are stories and myths related to this time period, such as the Book of Enoch, that describe in the events after the descent of the angels from heaven, that people begin eating blood and everything goes mad. So there's a lot of ways it could be perceived. It's unsure exactly. Nobody can say definitively. Nobody can say definitively that Nibiru was another planet or a spaceship. They can't say whether it was maybe a temple on a hill, like an Olympian temple on a mountain, which is described directly in some of the history of the area. The Temple of Enlil, for instance, is built directly into a mountain, on top of a mountain, so that in order to visit the court of Enlil, you have to climb a mountain to a top where the gods live and judge you as gods, and their word can't be refuted. So, this figure Adapa goes to Nibiru, the temple of Nibiru, whether it's in heaven, whether it's a temple on a hill, whether it's in the mind, whether it's a spiritual journey to a higher dimension. It's unsure. Maybe it's a little bit of all of those at the same time. Maybe the dimensions back then were perceived differently, and people perceived reality on a different level, and going up there was going up to heaven. Or maybe they were able to astral project in a way that we can't fathom. In any case, whenever Adapa returns to the world below, he becomes a renowned figure. His name becomes synonymous with wisdom, and he becomes an exorcist and a priest, an incantation priest, who oversees rites and rituals in Sumeria. Rites and rituals that resemble the rites and rituals of Egypt, where they wrap bodies, they sanctify them, they purify them in rituals. They wrap them in salt, they wrap them in garments and treat them in a respectable manner. They put them through rites and rituals and bury them in a special place. It said that he was overseeing these kinds of things. He was working with spirits. He was healing the sick. He was healing the sick not like a miracle, but through knowledge of arts, crafts, sciences, which Ea Enki was the patron god of. And that far back, magic was knowledge, knowledge was magic, knowledge was power, because if you could build something out of your knowledge, or grow something out of your knowledge, or knew where something was out of your knowledge, that was a way of bringing it into your reality. If you could envision a temple, a ziggurat temple, create a flawless diagram, you could bring that temple out of your imagination. You could draw it down from the heavens. So they had multiple layers of thinking to their entire mythology and philosophy. Adapa, the sage, afterwards, after his encounter with falling into the sea and rising to Nibiru, becomes an Apkallu priest of Ea Enki, working out of the temple. In some myths, he becomes the king of Eridu, and in some myths, he works closely with the king of Eridu, named Ululum. They go on Indiana Jones-like adventures, doing tomb raiding into, at that already ancient time, ancient temples. In my research into this time period, I found that what they have discovered of Eridu is that it was started around 5,400 BCE. And it took me a long time to trace timelines of the rises and falls of civilization. But the first major fall of civilization in Sumeria was several thousand years later. That means for at least 1, 2, or around 2,500 years, the city of Eridu grew and flourished into a sort of Persian Gulf empire of genies and intrigue and Babylonian warriors and warrior kings. Eventually, the Anunnaki themselves were represented by people ruling over the cities, and statues in the cities, and each city had holy tablets and statues dedicated to the god. And the power struggle between all of these forces culminated in the gods, war of the gods almost. So, the different cities were dedicated to different deities, and the priests of the temples of each city dedicated to those deities, they became like tribes dedicated to patron gods. And at a certain point, there's these tablets called the Laments, the Lamentations, and it's the event of the deluge of Sumeria. So, at a certain point, after civilization in Eridu and in Uruk and greater Babylonian civilization, there's a great war, a great deluge that rises. And the myths themselves, written in the original tablets that were translated, it says that the Anunnaki gods, the patron gods of their cities, in council decreed an end to civilization, that it should be started over, that the slate should be wiped clean. And Ea Enki, troubled by this, troubled by the destruction of what he views as his children and his home, his city, revolts against the authority of Enlil and Anu of Nibiru, and warns a figure. He warns one figure, a priest, presumably an Abgal or an Apkallu priest of one of the cities, a man of peace and knowledgeable in Sumerian ways. He goes to this man, Ea Enki. It implies that the spirit now, the spirit of Ea Enki, goes as a fly and speaks through the walls at the temple to this man and warns him of an incoming disaster in Sumeria, and that the gods have decreed a destruction and a deluge. And he knows firsthand, Ea Enki, from being present in the court of the Anunnaki as a prominent member. The rest of the gods agree, they go along with Enlil, and by doing this, by warning this man who has different names according to different mythologies and histories, he's named Ziusudra in one, he's named in the Atrahasis as Atrahasis, he's named in the Epic of Gilgamesh as Utnapishtim. He's the man who survives the flood. He's Noah of the Bible. Except in the original Sumerian mythology, the tablets were buried. They were baked and buried at the time that it happened. So by being older, they are closer to the source. And the story they tell is much more believable and much more realistic. The story described on the tablets of Sumeria for the deluge is a Jedi. It is a feudal war. A feudal war is something that we recognize from more modern mythology. We've seen feudal wars across the world. In Japan, the Jedi of Japan, there was an emperor, there was a king, there were feudal shoguns and lords, there was competition for power, there was a power struggle, there was power vacuums happening from the power struggle. There were tribes and clans with different philosophies rising against one another in a battle for supremacy and dominance of the land. The implication in Sumerian mythology is that Anu and Enlil were the supreme authority in the land. They were the eagle overseeing everything. They were the royal dynasty, the divine royal hierarchy, the gods, according to themselves. The story of the deluge of Sumeria is a story of opposing philosophies that come to conflict. This boils over into later myths, but the best one that I can pin it to is this myth of Prometheus. Prometheus steals the fire of the gods and gives it to humanity. In effect, making humanity have the fire of the gods themselves, and this is punishable by Zeus. The king of the gods sees this as a threat to his own power, that the humans, the petty, pitiful, pathetic, lesser than the humans should have this gift of fire, this intellect of the gods. So Prometheus is brought low, he's punished, he's cast out. He's put into an alternate dimension in Tartarus and punished eternally by a vulture, until later in the myths, in some myths, he's rescued by Hercules, or in some obscure variations of the myths, he's rescued by Hephaestus, who is a castaway son of Zeus because he's supposed to be a freak in some way. These stories go back to an original event. There was something that happened. There was a deluge, but it's not what we're told. It wasn't a all-encompassing planet-wide flood that lasted for 40 days and wiped out every single man, woman, child, and living creature on the face of it all. It was a war. The very first war. In a place that had known no war. That had developed without war for up to 2,000 years. A place that for 2,000 years was able to flourish and grow just in the name of helping and rise the people up and create a civilization, to have food every year, yearly, in abundance, to have new items, markets, to have reading and writing. Some of the Sumerian myths, they read not like myths at all. The tablets, they don't read like a myth. Some of them read like diary entries, giving exact numbers of pounds of grain, how to properly till a field, how to properly plow, how to tie a plow on an oxen, and how to properly plant the seeds 2 inches deep. Some of the Sumerian tablets blow the lid off the idea of some of the other mythologies because of how grounded and based they are, how rational and logical they are, and how primitive they are, and how anciently old they are. Those original accounts from Sumeria, they tell the truth of what happened, and by analyzing those stories and that mythos, you can see how a game of telephone happens and how civilizations become camps that oppose each other based on philosophies that come down from the powers that be in control of society. The reason Ea Enki was able to flourish during his time is because he was an agricultural god of knowledge. So he provided abundance and food. In his myths, it says he stacked the piles high. He was an essential member of the Anunnaki by providing for the kingdom, you could say. By his process of teaching people, allowing them to provide for themselves and provide extra that could be paid as taxes to Nibiru and to the higher level cities, the hierarchy, the royalty. So basically, there are a number of these myths where, over time, it seems that Enki is contradictory as a god of trickery to the higher level gods. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim, while trying to explain how immortality works to Gilgamesh, says, while explaining what happened during the flood, that it is Ea Enki who came to him to warn him so that he would be out at sea when the flood occurred, when the war happened, when the cities were invaded. He said that the storms rolled over like a cloak. The fire rose from the cities. It was like a shadow fell across the land. But that he was out in a boat because he was advised to make a boat, that after it was all over, he was greeted by Enlil as he came out of the boat, and Enlil moved him. I forgot about this part. Enlil had been approached by Inanna, the goddess Inanna, and Inanna, with tears in her eyes, had begged Enlil to stop. In another myth, Enlil's son Suen had begged him to please show mercy, to please end this disaster. The gods had decided to destroy their cities, but amidst the destruction were reduced to ruin themselves, and they appealed to Enlil to have mercy. So whenever there was this one man who survived the deluge, it's out at sea for 7 days, it says in their mythology, not for 40. Man, 7 days at sea with his entire farm, his farm animals, not just his family, but his entire group, his farm hands, himself, his wife, his children, and his as much farm animals and food as he could get onto the craft he had built. That he had been shown mercy by Enlil. Enlil pulls him out of the boat. It says he uses his hand, that there is a man as a king, a lord of the land, a king Enlil, a god king Enlil, who pulls Utnapishtim out of the boat and grants mercy to him, and that Utnapishtim prostrates himself before Enlil and says, okay, you're in charge. And Utnapishtim is taken to a new city upriver, away from the devastation, and becomes an Anunnaki god with the rest of the gods in this new location. And this is the location that Gilgamesh is seeking him out at. I've looked on the maps at this period. It's much up the river valley. So Gilgamesh had to go on an adventure up the river valley to get to the area where Utnapishtim was. Utnapishtim presents a challenge to Gilgamesh that if Gilgamesh wants to be immortal, that he must, if I remember correctly, fast for 40 entire days. He must not sleep, and he must fast from food. And if I remember correctly, it's after 7 days. I could have it mistaken. It might have been 7 days, and then after a couple of days he fell asleep. But he's supposed to fast for a amount of time and not sleep. He fails his challenge. He falls asleep, and he crashes so deeply that he's sleeping for days. And then finally Utnapishtim puts food by his head so that when he wakes up he'll have food. And whenever finally Gilgamesh wakes up, Gilgamesh is heartbroken that he was failed his test. And Utnapishtim offers Gilgamesh the advice that he can still prolong his life by seeking out a special plant deep in the ocean, in the underworld, in the underwater, in the sea, with spikes on it, a prickly plant in the sea, that this plant will help prolong Gilgamesh's life, since Gilgamesh is unable to achieve immortality through fasting and meditation and self-will. So Utnapishtim gives Gilgamesh this advice. Gilgamesh leaves brokenhearted, but also seeks out this plant. He dives into the sea, he finds the plant, he gathers the plant, he keeps the plant with him. Later, on his journey back to his home state, his home city, he's bathing by a pool of water, and a serpent comes out of the pool of water and snatches the plant, takes it back down into the deep. And Gilgamesh loses the plant that's even supposed to prolong his life. Finally, this leaves Gilgamesh an utterly, totally broken person. He returns to the city of Uruk, the seat of Babylon, a broken man. It's said that he's depressed and broken and becomes a bit of a street urchin, a shadow of his former self on his return. But to be honest, if you trace the history of Gilgamesh in most of his stories, and in this epic itself, it says that he was a terror. He was an absolute terror beforehand. He did as he pleased as the giant king of Babylon and had his way with people many times. So he was not a holy person. He was a Babylonian warrior king, giant, seeking immortality. He was unable to achieve immortality, according to this myth, and he dies on the streets, a broken man, before presumably being judged in the underworld. The entire story here traces a civilization that existed, founded in the year 5500 to 5400 BCE in the southern area of Sumeria by the horned god and goddess, the ibex of the sea, the goat of Sumeria, the firstborn son of On, perfect in all of his ways, the eldest son, with lapis lazuli and precious pipes and gems built into his very being. In one of the myths, Enki's journey to Nibiru, the priest that represents Enki, he provides instruments, the lyre, the drum, singers, he tunes them, he provides drumsticks, he provides incantation spells. Presumably provides hymns and music to the temples. He has music as part of his iconography and his symbolism. Directly. Silver and lapis lazuli lyres, silver and lapis lazuli drums, special drumsticks. He's dispensing them to the temple so that the temples can raise up a royal reception. What is a reception? What is a royal parade without drums and music? So it was an essential part of their culture. Eventually, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it says that Utnapishtim says that Ea Enki comes to him and says that he will no longer be accepted in the land. He's cast out for his pride. Ea Enki in his myth is prideful. He's like, I am the eldest. I am the wisest. I am the one who raises the stacks high. He's too prideful. It becomes a challenge to the authority of Anu and Enlil. In terms of a Jedi, of a feudal land, there's royal implications of intrigue, royal intrigue. Agents, being dispatched from city to city, spying begins to happen. People begin to wonder if someone's a threat to their power. This is a story that we know well this far into the future. We have a full, long history of wars over these types of things. Anu and Enlil being upset in the myths that too much noise is coming from Eridu. Oh, the raucous sound is more than I can bear. The city grows too clamorous. It grows beyond its domain to control. It was a threat to power. The knowledge, the gift of fire, was a threat to power. The flourishing civilization based on knowledge and respect for the feminine and nature was a challenge to the empirical might, the raw authoritarian power of being the king of the gods, in control of the armies, the one whom the stacks go to. It created a divide, because Enki made it to where people could provide for themselves. They didn't need a king. They were becoming kings themselves. They were becoming sovereigns. The goddess is known as the god of the sovereign. By him being linked to the goddess, he was the god of the sovereign, the god of the self-ruling, the ones who rule through knowledge, the ones who refuse and rebel tyrannical, non-questioning authority. This deluge forced an exodus. I've been tracing this for years. I've been looking at the times, the rises and the falls, the years, the archaeological research. The fall of Sumeria forced an exodus. The exodus is the confusion of languages. The deluge is the confusion of languages. Because in the deluge, every temple was reduced to ruin. Every tablet was destroyed. The tablets were their history. They were relying on those tablets to know the history. That was part of the deal. That was what Anunnaki, the An and Enlil were decreeing. That's why they wanted to clean the slate. They wanted to create a new order. In order to create a new order, you have to get rid of the old order. So they wiped out everything, so that they could now say it was God and his angels. It was no longer a team of gods. It was no longer a pantheon of many gods. It was now one almighty, all-powerful force of nature and his underlings behind it all. It's a propaganda. It's a form of propaganda. The winners write the story. Enlil, the king of the gods, won the war in Sumeria, and he wrote the story afterwards. That's why Pan, the satyr, Osiris, pagan mythology, it's all evil, right? That's why it's all evil. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years of propaganda against a being who was a threat to the authority of an empire. Because knowledge made people sovereign, and abundance allowed them to thrive on their own and made them kings unto themselves. That's the story of Adapa the sage. Adapa was a man who became a king unto himself by being a sage and a priest of his god Ea Enki, the ibex of the sea, the god of the abyss, the horned god, you know what I'm saying? The light, the morning star, the priest of the morning star in ancient Sumeria became a king and a god unto himself by virtue of knowledge itself. He became sought out as a god king because he was smart and he could help people. As opposed to the king god who cast people into dungeonous pits and tortured them publicly. The story progresses over time in Sumeria. The beings known as the Anunnaki later become known as the Jinn. And in Jinnology and in Jinn mythology, they say that originally the Jinn were the satyrs and the nymphs of the desert. So the Anunnaki there are like satyrs and nymphs. They are Jinn. Jinn are described as interdimensional alien beings made of a plasma-like shadow. They come from a super or sub-dimension. They're described as a cosmic serpent race, like seraphim and cherubim from biblical mythology. Cosmic serpent race from the stars, from the literal stars, from the sky, from the heavens coming down. That is what the Jinn are described as in some of their myths. That's why they have cosmic knowledge and cosmic power. These stories, as collapses and migrations and exoduses and cycles of empire take place, they become all of the different mythologies. The confusion of mythologies branches into the other mythologies. Greek is a branch of the confusion. Egyptian is a branch of the confusion. Hindu is a branch of the confusion. You go north, you got the Germanic Wotan, Odin. He is Ea Enki. They decided up there that Ea Enki was way cooler than Enlil. They chose Ea Enki's side. So they made Ea Enki the main guy. Called him Odin. Down in, Hindu mythology has almost got the most balanced, scientific, symbolic way of looking at it, because they had those trinity of three main gods, and Shiva is just the lord of the he's the crazy god of destruction. He's a bit wild. He's like the wild god, associated to music, associated to dance, associated to all of very similar things. The way Enki is associated to Enkidu, the wild guy who lives outside the city. Shiva has a leopard print. He's wild. He's outside of civilized society. The symbolisms carry over. In Egyptian mythology, this story of the deluge of Sumeria, it evolves into the story of Osiris and Set. Enlil is Set from their point of view, from whenever they look at what happened in Sumeria, which is the empire that was to the northeast of them. The empire to the northeast of the beginning little pocket civilization of Egypt. If you look at the times, it lines up too, because you have Eridu at 5500, and you have the empires of Egypt rising at 3500. 2,000 years later, with amazing knowledge from thousands of years of somethings from some civilization that collapsed that nobody knows about. Maybe it's Atlantis, right? Well, maybe Sumeria pre-flood was Atlantis. Maybe they had 2,000 years of knowledge of studying the stars without war that allowed knowledge to truly flourish, without this idea of controlling people by keeping them ignorant and enslaved. So in Egypt, Their god Osiris is laid to waste, cast to the edges of the empire, and put into the underworld. He's the god of the underworld, the exact same way Ea Enki is the god of the underworld. The same way that Adapa becomes an embodiment of Ea Enki, who is the wisest of the kings in Sumeria, we have the Horus kings of Egypt that are put forward by goddess traditions. Like Eridu is founded in honor of a Ninhursag figure who is described as a sacred cow, just like Hathor is the sacred holy cow of Egypt. If you trace these things far enough back, it goes back to them being star beings, like the Jinn are described as cosmic beings. Well, Isis and Osiris are correlating to specific stars in the sky, the stars Orion and Sirius. So they are cosmic intelligences, star seeds, quantum intelligence, cosmic intelligence with a perspective from the stars, having embodiments in priests on earth. That's part of the concept, is that the pharaoh is the reincarnation of the god who was killed and descended into the underworld, who rises back up in a cyclical nature to overcome the tyrannical chaos god who had destroyed everything and taken everything over. It's symbolic. The mythology is symbolic of a story. It's like a story happens, it becomes a story, becomes a myth, becomes a legend, then it gets worked into a mythology. The Egyptian mythology is referencing this battle between the gods that went back to the collapse, the previous cycle of empire, the cycle of empire happening in Sumeria that led to Ea Enki being cast out of the heaven-like civilization into the wastes and the wild, the chaos, right? To the world below, to the Black Land. So, Egypt represents a breakaway civilization founded off the knowledge of Eridu. Eridu is brought low by the empire of Anu and Enlil. The archetypes there begin to evolve and change with the invaders. The invaders bring their own way of viewing these gods. Inanna becomes Ishtar. She becomes a little bit more terrible in a way. Her eyes become red. She becomes more ferocious. She has claws for her feet. Well, in the earlier mythology, she is a dove of peace associated to her. It's because the invaders take these archetypes, they make them their own, they change them to suit their personality. So good gods can become terrible gods. Bad gods could be not as bad as we realize because the bad guys were saying that the good guys were bad. In a case of inversion, it becomes this big complicated mess. Truly though, Egypt was an enlightened society for its time. It had feminine care and nature in its very mythology, with the god being chosen by a goddess who lovingly puts him forward as a caretaker of the land, as a spiritual beekeeper to the people, running a beehive of society for the best benefit of everyone. That is the difference in philosophy that comes down to us between the ideas of empire and the ideas of heathen, savage tribalry. Tribes are communal. Everything is for the best benefit of everyone. The land doesn't belong to anyone. The land is a provider that we belong to, that we have to take care of so that it will take care of us, while the other empires become ones like pirates. They want to go and take from people who have it because they have swords. They don't want to grow the food themselves. They just want to take the food. You see, it becomes the never-ending cycle of war, the never-ending cycle that we all have to go through every generation almost. And we ought to be familiar with it by now. We ought to be able to see this cycle clearly and see how we're falling into these patterns and pick sides, I suppose, or try to go back to the original standard that existed before sides were developed. such as the original 7 Anunnaki working together as some kind of a space team to proudly present the first civilization. We need something like that, because the way it is now, it's the division that's breaking everything down. It's going to lead to another deluge. It's going to lead to another global war. By dedicating myself to Adapa the Sage after being inspired by the myth, I have done a lot of reading. I promise you. I've done a lot of studying. Years and years of it. To try to make sure that I've got the story right in my head, that I'm not just, some delusional freak that read some stuff and was like, oh, that's going to become the obsession of my entire life. No, I was like, there is something here. There's something profound here, and it's important. And people don't understand why it's important, but it's important because it explains our history and our mythology. It explains how we think and view the world. When we think of beings of other dimensions, what do we think of? Angels, or do we think of fairies? Do we think of underworld spirits, Ushumgal serpents? Do we think of Valkyries? Do we think of dwarves? What do we think of? It all comes down to our framework. And I've learned by studying Sumerian that there was a single framework, an unconfused language that existed. There was a unification where everybody was on the same boat. Everybody was working together. And it was causing the rise of the greatest, an Atlantean level fucking ancient civilization, just by virtue of everybody working together and there being no war. And focusing on a god of knowledge, whether the gods are real or not, by focusing on a god, an archetype of knowledge and harmony with nature. They built that archetype in their own personalities, and they became a people who were able to work in harmony with and thrive in an ancient primitive world surrounded by imminent death on all directions if they didn't figure it out. So I get very inspired by Sumeria, and I feel myself as like this story is part of who we all are on the entire face of the whole planet. There's a lot of people who want to. This is my story. This is my story. It's everybody's story. It's all of our stories. We're all Semitic, right? If the first languages in all of the first written languages, the first spoken, proper, developed civilization was right there in that area. That is what became every other civilization. So every civilization is just another lens, another perspective on a larger picture, a cohesive whole, a homogenized unit that should be unified instead of divided. We should unconfound the language. We should unite the traditions instead of having them divided against one another. And this is the one period in all of history, the first time in the entire timeline, that reality is set up in such a way that people can connect the dots and see the bigger picture. And instead, everybody is compartmentalized. They're academically required by contracts to only follow accepted narratives, instead of uncompartmentalizing themselves and stepping back and seeing a larger picture, that these are not all isolated little linear things that happened. It's like a cycle of standing on the shoulders of giants who die, and then we become bigger giants standing on those giants in a never-ending thing, a never-ending cycle that builds out the complexity of the overall fractal holographic spiritually manifest into physicality reality. By understanding things such as mythology, you begin to develop an inner world, a spiritual view of reality that is scientific somehow too. Fits perfectly with our modern concepts of interdimensional aliens. Whenever you talk about a serpent cosmic jinn from the stars, what is that? What is that? Has horns and wings, right? Antenna. It can fly. It's a shadow orb. It's a light orb that can fly. It's a fairy orb in the forest. What is a UFO? Isn't it a light orb that looks like it moves like it's thinking somehow, but it's made of light somehow, a being made of light, a shining one, a being of light that comes down from above or up from below in a interdimensional, multi-dimensional, fractal holographic spiritual matrix of some kind that is beyond even scientists' ability to fathom. One thing I've learned through studying all this stuff is that the world is much more magic than people realize. It's much more like that than we realize, that we have some kind of a quantum effect on reality. That's part of why the fire of the gods gifted to us by Prometheus was a threat to Zeus. Because as we elevate our own consciousness, we begin to have a grasp over the reality that we exist in. Collectively, humanity in an awakened state becomes a sort of force that transcends the idea of a king of the gods. We become a collective of gods. We become billions of different views of reality. The overall fractal holographic matrix becomes infinitely complex with each new observer, and each observer impacting the overall fractal reality. Now we have a point where we have people across the face of the planet that are bringing things into creation, creating music, creating art, creating technology. The fractal hologram is growing. It's becoming more complex. We are becoming a hive mind in some regards, aided by an evolution of technology that mirrors and follows and combats against our own evolution. We're reaching like a point of some kind of strange new age, a dawn of a new age, a singularity, where I like to think of it as the crossing of dimensions, because I'm a Cancer. And the symbology of the Cancer is that there's two claws crossing. Two constellations briefly connecting as they cross each other. That's what I think the crossing is. It's the realm, the dimension, the planet, the higher fifth dimensional, sixth dimensional, seventh dimensional aspect of our fractal holographic matrix coming down a level, like water being poured on reality. As that water rises from the bottom and lifts the lower dimensions into our reality, creating a complex spiritual soup of high energetic phenomenon just behind the veil of perception of what we see in the physical reality. And as a result, we have the world going mad right now. The world is going mad. Everybody's people wanting control, people just wanting to be free, people just trying to survive, people just the world is going mad. It's like a crossing. It's like a pole reversal. It's like a completely secularized and scientific society suddenly seeing ghosts and going, fucking ghosts aren't supposed to be real. And it's people who believe in ghosts seeing aliens, saying aliens aren't supposed to be fucking real. It's people who believe in aliens seeing ghosts. It's a whole complex miasma of hard to understand, because it's truly interdimensional in spectrum type of subjects and topics. That's why it takes things like magical occult philosophy and hermetic wisdom in order to grasp the ideas, because they introduce to the practitioner the idea that there is an unseen reality consisting of forces that we don't fully understand. It's only trickled to us barely by the narrative that we get through established religion. What established religion really was taking all of these kinds of secrets of who we are and reality and how it works, saying, these are ours now. And you all get a little bit. You can learn just enough to be obedient and come to us whenever you need guidance.
It's a power game. It's a power struggle. Just like in some, what was it? Was the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi? There's some Gnostic text that says, "Split a piece of wood and I am there. Leave the stone and you will find me." The implication is that there's some kind of a divine connection within us directly, that we are spiritual antennas to an unperceivable realm, that we are multi-dimensional beings that transcend physical flesh, and that we have this capability within ourselves to directly heal ourselves, to do miracles on ourselves. Why do we need a priest or a saint or a god if we can heal ourselves? Why does a person need a miracle if they're living right in a way that doesn't make them sick? Or if they're surrounded by the kind of loving energy that allows them to get better? Maybe it's beyond the concepts of religious dogma that say that only a saint can grant your way into heaven. They had a point in history where saints were taking tithes to get into heaven. What does that fucking mean? Oh, well, anybody can go to heaven. Just pay me £100. No. The idea in actual occult tradition and Eastern philosophy and the underlying symbolism of things like Hindu mythology is that there is a truly spiritual chakra system that we have to keep clean and elevate through things like eating right and practicing, self-control and discipline over the creature that we are. The idea in Egypt is the crook and the flail, that we are some kind of crazy animalistic beasts that have to control ourselves by using a crook and a flail, in order that we are more than beasts, that we are human. And that's what the story of Adapa was. He was a man that was made more than an animal. He was lifted, he was elevated to the status of Anunnaki by virtue of conducting himself with honor in service to his god, even if his god was the horned one from the abyss. And that by conducting himself properly, that he ascended to a higher state of being, recognized by other gods. That he reached a state of apotheosis, in which he himself transcended the physical domain. That's a tradition that becomes the mystery school tradition. It becomes the Freemasonic tradition. It becomes the biblical dogmatic tradition of every one of the three primary religions, finding their root, going back somehow to this story. Well, Enki is also Iblis. He's the guy cast out who walked up every stair to the door to heaven, who was the most favored of God. The first true monotheist is what they call Iblis in Islam. And that's Enki. He's the guy who stacked the piles high. He got fucking cast out of the region and became the devil. While in other religions, he became Horus the falcon god. And in the religion where he became Horus the falcon god, they had perfectly aligned pyramids to the entire cosmic reality. So, I don't know, maybe Lucifer's version of civilization would be more advanced. Maybe we'd have pyramids that generate 0-point energy, and we'd all know what the fuck we are. But anyway, namaste, many blessings. I love all of you. I'm pretty sure that I am a fishman myself. I feel drawn to this history and mythology. I feel connected to the ibex of the sea in a strong way. Now, I don't know what you would call that. It's not like I'm a Satanist. It's not like I'm a Luciferian. I don't know what you would call it. But I'm not a bad person. It's not like I'm a satanic evil. No. I'm knowledge. I'm pursuing knowledge, arts, crafts, wisdom, and understanding the mischief of it all. How it creates mischief, just creating things. Like this, who's to say this won't create mischief? Or who's to say this isn't mischief? Creating something creates mischief in a way. Like, oh, I want to build something. All of a sudden, there's some dude going around doing all this weird stuff. Nobody knows why he's doing it. Well, he's building something. He's creating mischief. Now he needs supplies so that he can make noise in the middle of the night so that he can build something. Anyway, That's what I'm doing right now. I'm making noise in the middle of the night so I can build something. Much love, peace, love, harmony. I love all of you. I am Adapa the Sage. I am Adapa the Sage. I am Adapa the Sage. They said that for hundreds of years after that man died, trying to invoke his presence and his knowledge and his wisdom in their rituals. Kings for hundreds of years, and the empire of Babylon would say, I am Adapa the Sage, hoping to be even close to the level of wisdom that whoever this man was had. So, empower yourself. Control yourself. Take the crook and the flail. Rise up, be Horus kings and Isis goddesses. Be divine in your presence, and don't take no for an answer, and don't be slaves, and elevate yourselves with knowledge and become amazing wielders of the Promethean fire that challenge Zeus himself. Much love.